despite my incredibly undescriptive title. I'm glad you could all come. So, my name's Jamie, and I'm a game artist from New Zealand, and I'm going to talk about my design work on the UI of Mini Metro. So I've been in the game development industry for over 15 years, and I started out as a 3D artist and became a lead artist at a small, medium-sized studio in New Zealand. And now I do more contract work, and in between that I work on my own titles. So, Mini Metro. First, I'll talk a bit about the experience we were shooting for and how this impacted on the UI content, and then why we made certain decisions, and then how we wrap that content into the package that you see today. But first, I'll introduce the game and how I came to work on it. And for the uninitiated, I'll just show a quick app preview video of the game. Okay, so Mini Metro was the brainchild of Robert and Peter Curry. They started development on the game back in 2013 for a Ludum Dare game jam, and they made this, brilliant little prototype, and it showed a lot of promise. So they kind of went off to develop the game further. At that time, I was creating the game design and art for a turn-based bar brawling game with bears called Bare Knuckle. But I was going through a lot of design problems and hitting a few roadblocks, so I was pretty receptive to any distractions. So when I got this email, I was pretty excited to open it, and it said, "Hey Jamie," and I replied and said, "Hey Pete." And it went on like this for quite some time. And then eventually Pete said, "Hey, do you know anyone who wants to work on the UI of Mini Metro?" And I said, "Yep, I can do that. It'll probably take about 2 weeks." And then game development being game development, things dragged on for quite some time. And 2 years later, we end up here in this place. So over that time, it's been a finalist for quite a few awards, and it won Excellence in Audio at the IGFs in 2016, due to the brilliant work of Rich Vreeland and Pete. And probably more importantly, it was a finalist for Excellence in Art. And then at the end of 2016, it was chosen for the best of App Store promotion. And so that was, a great reward for a lot of hard work. So over those 2 years, just to give you an idea of the volume of visual iteration that went into the game, I somehow managed to spit out over 4,000 images, 112 previs videos, and 12 gigs of data. So in terms of sales, the game has shifted 800,000 units to date. That's across all platforms: Steam, Mac, and mobile, Android and iOS. And so far it's grossed over $3 million US, and it has a 96% overwhelming positive Steam rating. Okay, so those 2 weeks that turned into 2 years. How exactly did we get here? You could probably say the design process looked a little bit like that image. Invariably, the design process starts with understanding your subject matter, and in this case, that's understanding a game that's halfway through development. So it can be a bit of a shifting target. But you can start with a simple question. And that question is, what is the game about? What is the experience exactly that you're designing for? So you might come up with a list that looks a little bit like this. The game is about building efficient networks, minimalism, score chasing, city planning. But this list, kind of feels a little bit surface level, and it doesn't quite get to the root of the nature of the game. So if we dig a little bit deeper and go back to the very original inspiration of the game, which is the London Tube map, and if we go right back to to the birth of the game, to where the original inspiration came from, and as I understand it, that came from Rob standing in the London Underground, trying to work out how to get from point A to point B. So you can say that the origins of the game is more in interpreting maps, and the core idea of the game is possibly more about observing, reading those different shapes and lines and colors and trying to work out how they all work together. So maybe you could say the game is more about observing, decoding, experimenting, discovery, and by extension, learning. So at this point, I should probably point out that it's a lot easier to come up with this sort of list in hindsight. At the time, I'm probably operating more on an intuitive understanding of the game, and that was based on playing the prototype, and kind of with the prototype, it was extremely bare bones. It was just some shapes, and you connect them and try and figure out how it all works yourself. So that process, was incredibly rewarding, and that's the experience that which we tried to imbue in the game through the UI design and the UX. So how do we build a UI UX that encourages and supports this? The UI content and the UI flow can set the tone and expectation of the player, and even by the things you choose to omit, you can change this tone and experience that the player has. So there's three main areas of the UI design where I was particularly conscious about setting the right tone. The first one being the new user flow or the tutorial. So this is a quick time lapse of the new user flow. So you can see this really strips back the game to its very bare components and only exposes the player to one thing at a time. And so by breaking things down into components and staging them very slowly, you can teach incredibly complex things to players. Some things to keep in mind with this approach is that it does require a lot of testing, and you need to get the pacing correct for all sorts of different types of players. And that's probably something we needed to do better on Mini Metro in terms of pacing out how that tutorial went. And don't necessarily feel the need to over-explain things to the player. There's two reasons for that. One, new players don't necessarily need to know everything about the game straight away. And secondly, it leaves the door open for players to discover new features later on their own accord. And this is something we're actively trying to incentivize in the game, is that sense of experimentation and discovery. And the other thing is we didn't use any text. So for a lot of people, this is frustrating. And this was primarily motivated by our desire for minimalism, but it also serves another purpose of encouraging players to observe the game symbols and game visual language rather than reading. Often you can maybe think of this like a game of charades, where if someone starts speaking in the middle of the game of charades, it kind of ruins the game. It's more efficient and it's quicker and it's faster, but it also just undercuts the whole game. The next area is the in-game UI. The best way I can explain my approach to the HUD is with the idea of a toy train set. So a toy train set is strongly entwined with the idea of observing, experimenting, and discovery. And it's a very consequence-free environment where you just play around with tracks, rebuild them, lay them out, pick trains up, put them down. And that kind of explains our approach in Mini Metro, where there's no, in the default game mode, there's no penalty for relaying out tracks and taking your time to do so. You can pause time, relay out everything you like, and just play around and experiment with the game. So one thing I was very conscious of is to not build a shell over this game and to have a HUD which takes functionality off the tracks itself. And one thing that became obvious is that the HUD was most beautiful when it wasn't there at all. So for example, this is a really old HUD mock-up where we were toying with the idea of shifting functions onto the HUD. And here's a later mock-up for mobile, where you can see that the HUD expands and retracts to stay out of the way. So some other in-game UI things to keep in mind. Where possible, simplify rules that are hard to communicate. Initially, we had a lot of complicated rules in the game, which were causing a lot of frustration, and they were blinging up errors all over the place. And a lot of people, just couldn't understand them. So rather than try and design our way out of the hole visually, we can go back to the game design and change the game design itself. I'll show an example of that later on. And one kind of idea to operate by with this sort of thing is to be the world's worst magician. Magicians operate on the idea of misdirection, where they create a distraction and present a trick. And that's the complete opposite approach you need to take with displaying errors in game. So always be aware of where the player's attention is and display your errors at that point. And lastly, for the in-game visuals, I was very conscious to avoid adding in any extraneous visual rewards. This could possibly be summarized as the desert golf approach. I absolutely love this game, and it kind of became a bit of a touchstone during development. So if anyone hasn't played it, this is a game where you can hit a hole-in-one and absolutely nothing happens. But at the same time, you still feel quite rewarded for having done so. So that was a very similar approach to Mini Metro. So this is, again, some early error previews, and you can see this is an incredibly bad idea. I've got errors displaying in two different locations, so obviously a person's attention can't be split into two different areas. And then this is another example where we changed the errors to occur at the point of mouse interaction. So we know the person's already looking there and it's going to come through. And this is when we had the no line crossing rule in the game, and that was an example of an error that we took out of the game just to simplify communication. The last area is UI flow. So one thing we took out of the UI flow was the leaderboards. The easiest way to explain this is that for us, leaderboards were kind of an extrinsic motivator, and we wanted to keep the motivations to the game inside the game, or inside you, intrinsic to the game. And the other thing is, we didn't want to hammer new players with leaderboards and point out how poorly they were doing all the time. And there's a lot of different reasons people play Mini Metro, and it's not always to do with competition. So we took the leaderboards and kind of reduced them to a button, but we took it even further and reduced it to a non-standard button for the UI. So this is breaking our UI convention. And then we kind of just nestled it, sort of hid it out of the main UI flow in the city select screen. And so instead of showing leaderboards, we show your personal bests, so that, that's important for you to establish whether your experimentation and progress in the game is occurring, is to see how well you're doing. And lastly, we avoided any meta-structures to the game. So we avoid any of these structures that aren't intrinsic to the game, like collectibles, unlockables, and any sort of currency. We do have unlockable cities just to limit the player choice when they enter the game, but even for some people, this can become a means to an end, where they just play through the game, unlocking all the cities, and then when they've unlocked the cities, they call it quits. So we try and avoid those sorts of situations. So we've talked about some of the ideas that gave form and structure to the UI. Now I'll kind of talk a little bit about how we gave it a look. So I might go without saying that the game itself is hugely inspired by Harry Beck, the designer of the Tube map. And one of the challenges was bringing this to life. So there was a lot of previs to do with spawning stations, how that might look. This is a really bad idea of a station spawn. Kind of looks like it's giving birth, but. And that even went as far as designing how the passengers overflow out of stations and how they bounce around. And then it's into kind of how the track handles layouts so that they're all accessible and under dense conditions. And then exploring station permutations and how the corner radii nest together. And then, even stuff like platform switching, where each station has 3 platform inputs from each angle. So when designing the front end, this particular book became a huge source of inspiration. This is designed by Vignelli and Bob Norder, and these guys spent 2 years making an immaculate design document for the subway signage system in New York. So, this was a big inspiration, and it's absolutely perfect. Well, almost perfect, but at the same time, it's kind of demoralizing looking at it, but they spent 2 years doing it, and if we tried to hit this kind of perfection, it would take us probably 4 years. So I took a lot of color samples from this, including the paper and the ink, which comes through into the whites and the blacks in the game. And we adopted some of the kerning, where the text is kind of shoved into the top left corner of the boxes. And and the way the signs are built in a square and modular fashion, so that comes through into the menu as well. So you can kind of see the influence coming through into the menu design there. Another big aspect of the game were the arrows and transitions. So anywhere where we have a transition in the game, we have a big black arrow, with the exception of the leaderboards, which we were demoting. So this is some early previs of the in-game transitions. So a big design goal of the UI was to have no cuts in the game whatsoever. So everything kind of freed flowly through from menu to game and back out. And that included the game over screen, where it kind of transitions smoothly Well, that's the early one, which was a bit more rough, but yeah, you get the idea. And that's just showing a transition, early previous transition to in-game. So all of these are done using, I did a lot of these in After Effects. But I had to dig a little bit further and look at things like subway maps, which see their influence in the city select screen, and even road signage imagery, which is used around the in-game icons. So this is a bunch of previews for the city select screen where you can kind of see that influence come through. And there's also a lot of the city screen is based on tube map line maps for subway systems. So that's basically all I've got today, but I'll just run through some takeaways and then hopefully take some questions if there are any questions. So the Mini-Metro takeaways would be: understand your game. The design process starts with understanding what you are designing for, and this can be intuitive to you or it can be explicit. And if you're in a team, it pays to keep an open discussion going throughout the project on the nature of your game. Find ways to encourage and support this through your UI content. Be mindful of what your UI is emphasizing to the player as important, and omitting some things can become, just as powerful as what you choose to include. Give people some credit. Don't be too scared to let them figure things out on their own. You don't have to over-explain everything with text prompts, and if you include enough visual cues and introduce elements to people at the right pace, they can learn, incredibly complex game mechanics. And then find your visual key and build a visual language around using inspiration that means something to your game. And if you can, make it relatable, so when people look at your game, they immediately have a connection to it. And then the last thing is iterate. Iterate a lot. Cool, that's all. You can find me on Twitter, or you can give me an email if you want, if you have any questions. Cool, thank you. Cool. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hey.
I have a question about your testing. You were saying that you did a lot of player testing, and I was wondering where you found your players, how often you were testing, etc.
Yeah. So the question is about how often we did testing and where we got our players to test from. We did we did quite a few trade shows. So a lot of that was just on the spot, watching how people play and whether they can pick up the game at the right speed. And then you can also watch YouTubers play the game for the very first time and see how they react to what they're playing. And then there's also streamers. But we didn't actually do too much in-house testing.
Yes.
Yep, thanks.
Obviously, Mini-Metro has a very unorthodox minimalist UI, and that's not generally what you see in iPhone games.
Yep.
Even personally, when I do minimalist UIs, people have an immediate assumption like, oh, you need to add pictures, or you need to do something more polished, or 3D-ish, or whatever.
Yep.
How'd you stick with the unorthodox UI, and did you receive that kind of feedback, and how did you overcome it or incorporate it, or did you tell them just go away?
So how did we, stay on the path of minimalism Is that generally what?
Yeah, in lieu of going with the standard iOS app look.
There were times where we went too minimal, and we had some player revolt in the Steam Early Access forums. So we did cut back on going too minimal. But I don't know. There was a lot of talk about adding more text into the game, but because the game was built on minimalism, it was easy to discard it using that as an excuse. Yeah, that's probably as good as I can answer. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hi. What are your biggest influencers on minimalism?
To be honest, one of my biggest influences on minimalism is probably what I showed you in the presentation. The New York City Transit Authority design manual was probably my biggest influence in that regard. But other than that, I really love minimalism, so I find it easy to just cut stuff out as much as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
One of the things I loved about Mini Metro was the sound design and how cohesive the sound and animation is. I was wondering if there was collaboration in that department, or is it more that the sound was done to match the animation?
Collaboration between the sound and the visuals.
Yeah.
A lot of that was handled by Pete, our programmer, and Rich Vreeland, and there was a large amount of collaboration there with changing the timing of the game so that it matched up with Rich's musical needs, if you catch what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's probably the last one.
I see that the game is not free to play. Can you expand a little more into what kind of decision? Because I'm pretty sure you discussed about the possibility.
Yeah, so why wasn't the game free to play? We talked about that, for months, and to make it free to play, we would have to gut the game too much because it came out on PC first as a premium title. So like adding advertising into it was a big no-no because it would just destroy the look of the game. And adding in systems for rewards like currencies just wasn't part of the philosophy of the game. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. Cool. Thanks, everyone.